Good morning, all. Thanks again, guys. We're really excited, very fortunate today that Bill Epperly is here to share the technical, what do we call this? Jesus and the Buddha, Buddha and Christianity is today's topic. So Bill Epperly, let me introduce you guys. Very happy that he's here, a spiritual director. Bill Epperly, PhD, a lifelong student practitioner of contemplative spirituality and mysticism. Bill is a spiritual guide and healer. He offers individuals a path to uncovering their natural connection with the divine in self, others, and in nature. Bill's an adjunct professor at DePaul, where he teaches courses in mindfulness and spirituality. Thank you very much for being here. And I guess you wanted to, there's a lot to say and share here. Bill thought, for a change of pace, we might start this with more of a Q&A, which will maybe help us lead the discussion. I know you got a lot to cover here. So is that all right? If people just raise their hands whenever?
Well, I have a few things I want to say to open up. First of all, thank you for being here today. The subject is so close to my heart, and maybe I'll stand. I really don't like to do that. But what am I? Am I a Christian? Am I Buddhist? Am I something more than either? Am I something of both? I've drunk from so many different streams in my life. Maybe some of you too. This is one of the places where I've taken an especially deep dive into Buddhism. So I figure you all know about Christianity. I know about Christianity too. I'm curious to hear what's percolating for you. What's of interest about Buddhism that we could talk about, share about. I'm interested to share some of the golden nuggets of my experience. So to begin, I just wanted to, so I'm going to show up as Buddhist today. I'm going to put on the beads that my Zen master gave me in 1990 before I went on pilgrimage to South Korea. I'm going to come out and just briefly reference. We have a little altar-like setup with a figure representing the Buddha. There were no Buddha figures for hundreds of years after his death. It was a purely oral tradition. I have the light, which has many symbolic meanings. A stick of incense, which I'm probably not going to burn. Incense can symbolize the beauty of our lives as they're lived. We give off the sweet perfume and also the impermanence that as soon as I light this stick, it's sure to burn out. And as sure as once a human is born, it's sure to die. And these are some of the big themes that Buddhism wants to address. The challenge of being born in a human body that is only going to get older and die. The challenge of living in the society we're in. So the stick of incense, and then I brought two ritual instruments. This is called a moktak. It looks a little bit like a fish. In the morning, the moktak is played to wake up all the beings that live in the waters. It's said. There's also a bell, a gong, or bell, might be 3 feet across to wake up the hell beings. A drum to wake up the beings, the drum might be 3 feet across to wake up the beings, all the four-legged beings. A metal sheet called a cloud that is said to awaken all the beings in the air and in the heavenly realms. So to wake everyone up. This is really the deep intention of the Buddhist path and training, teachings. And this would also be used to lead chanting, which is an important part of Buddhist devotional practice. Americans think a lot of meditation, and meditation is an important part of Buddhism, especially meditation Buddhism in Japan called Zen Buddhism, in Korea, San Buddhism, but it's by far not the only practice life. In my trip to Korea, there were monks who served a priestly function, conducting public services for the lay people, funerals, weekly services, much in a priestly role. There were sutra monks who studied the sacred texts of the religion, of the tradition, perhaps writing commentaries, perhaps chanting them as spiritual practice. There were monks who practiced chanting. We met some monks who had made a vow to chant 5,000 consecutive days for 5 hours or so a day. And there were others that would take that vow for 10 or 15,000 days. You can do a little quick math. I mean, we're talking about tens of years here. They feel such an affinity that they want to make this their practice. I talk about all this because when we read about Buddhism and hear about it, we get a lot of ideas in our head. But just like Christianity, it's a living tradition, and it's embodied in so many different ways. So, priestly monks, sutra monks, chanting monks, prostration monks that would perform devotional prostration as their practice, doing 1,000 or so prostrations a day. And then, I fancied myself a kind of Zen monk, the meditation monks, the elite, the snobs, who sought non-dual realization to realize their oneness with all that is, their oneness with the source of all that is, to replicate the experience of the founder of Buddhism, Shakyamuni Buddha. So great diversity of practice. And those are just the monks, the monastics, the professionals, if you will. The great majority of Buddhists in any country in the US, Southeast Asia, in any traditional Buddhist country, the great majority were lay practitioners working in the world, but having perhaps a home altar and making an occasional pilgrimage to the local temple off in the mountains. And for the lay practitioners, the embodiment of Buddhism is completely different orientation. For me, because I live in this world, for me, it's very similar to the comparison between lay Christian and, say, Trappist Christian, if you're familiar with the Trappist order, perhaps the most contemplative of the orders of Catholic monks and nuns. The Trappists are very ascetic in their practice. They have long hours of silence or contemplation, reflection, reading, as well as a full life of work and engagement with the community. A very different embodiment of Christianity than what most of us experience living in the world. And I don't know, now I got started here, but to me, one of the really exciting, and now Buddhism has come to the US. First, in, let's say, 1895, with the first Parliament of the World's Religions, when Americans got to meet Zen Buddhist masters, teachers, as well as teachers of Vedanta and other traditions. And now there's an American Buddhism group that's taken root here, growing here, which is like, and every time Buddhism's ever moved to a new country, it always brought in and harmonized with the local traditions, whatever they were, shamanism, Taoism, Confucianism. They've been brought in and harmonized. So now we have this wonderful melting pot experience in this country of Buddhism being inspired, cross-pollinating, as one person put it, cross-pollinating with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, perhaps. I'm not aware of that consciously, but it's going to happen. People bring their tradition to it, and so it's a very interesting time for Buddhism in this country. And just a fun fact, it has been true until recently, and may still be true, that the head of every American Buddhist center was Jewish. just something about that tradition.
Very interesting.
Which is this is a very earthy, down to earth tradition, perhaps like Judaism. So that was a case until it may still be the case. So that's a little bit about me, and kind of my deep interest in sharing. We have so little time, right? And everything I'm going to say is at least partly wrong because it's a summary. But I brought with me, just to go the next step, this is a little book of things purported to be said by the Buddha. The original teachings, Shakyamuni Buddha was born in, people are not sure, 563 or so before the Common Era, 563 or so, lived 80 years. His teachings were transmitted orally for about 400 years. There was no written down teaching for that period of time. So, they got, I'm sure there's a lot of the original granularity left out, but these are purported to be sayings of the Buddha, the Dhammapada, one of the more accessible collections. But if I had them all, I don't know if this room could hold them all. And today I put it side by side with my great uncle's King James version of the Bible. Uncle Burton was a Methodist minister in rural Virginia. He wrote in here, "Blessed Jesus is Lord, tell it with my life." And signed his name. That was kind of his commitment. And when I told him that I had this feeling that Jesus and Buddha were like brothers, he said, "Not so, can't possibly be so. Can't possibly be so." But Uncle Burton is gone now. And then in the town in rural Virginia where he used to live, there's a Buddhist center now. In the Appalachian, Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Change is coming, right?
Yeah,
We're getting to know each other,
Let's say Thich Nhat Hanh has one of his centers in my hometown in Batesville, Mississippi, on a hill overlooking the Delta.
Yeah, it's a beautiful center too. A friend of mine, been there.
And the old town actually started there, so he's moved in away, but it's near the river. But it's really interesting to see those monks there. I rode by it, and like just so weird, Mississippi, but they've been received really well.
That's cool to know. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh's an interesting example. He's a Vietnamese, well, he passed away recently. Vietnamese Zen Buddhist master, written 60, 80 books maybe. And many disaffected Christians and Jews went to his centers. And one of the things he liked to say was that our society is so uprooted that he hoped they would use the practices they learned to go home and be better Christians or Jews or Catholics, whatever they are. Rather, you don't have to take a course.
Was that in part, the late 60s, certain Americans disaffected or Vietnam War resistors?
Well, I think
I heard he used to speak.
then and through the 70s, when all the young people were going to India, seeking spiritual gurus, and to some extent till today, there's been a kind of romanticization of Asian spirituality by those that are just somewhat disaffected with what they found here. Then the third book I have, and then I might really stop talking, is called Speaking of Silence. This is a compilation of talks given by a group of monks, Buddhist and Christian, who got together for 20 or more years, comparing their ways. And this was one of the early, you see it's all marked up, one of the early gateway books that was important to me. So I don't know, maybe that's a little bit of something to kind of get things going. I could talk about central teachings or the life of the Buddha. I'm happy to do that. It's also all on Wikipedia in amazing detail with better recall of dates than I have. what is of interest to you?
Well, historically, there's a lot. Thank you. And please, don't join in, but Shakyamuni Buddha, how historically can we connect him to Siddhartha Gautama himself? I mean, how was he first enlightened? Or how many years apart were they?
Okay. Well, it's the same person.
Oh, he just changed his name.
He has several, like Jesus,
I guess
yes.
I'm told Shakyamuni was a later Buddha.
Hmm,
Oh, okay, thank you.
no, Gautama Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, same
Okay,
personage.
that helps.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions actually, but I'm curious, would, would you say if you're comparing Buddhism to Christianity, would, as a, in practice, is Christianity more prescriptive versus Buddhism, which is more contemplative or meditative, or am I completely off base?
yeah.
So that's just one of many questions that
I'll take a couple more questions and then we'll see which one might, is there another question? We'll see where it might start. Yes.
A number of years ago, I was in Vietnam and for a number of weeks. And it really, I was very impressed with the fact that Vietnamese were very friendly towards Americans, which I found surprising, given that we've gone through this war. And I asked the guide we were with why, and he said, well, you know, we have this history of Buddhism, even though not many of us practice it anymore. The history of Buddhism says that we should all be forgiving, and it permeates our society still. And that's kind of how we react towards what happened with the Vietnam War. And I've always found that fascinating. We're really interested in that idea of forgiveness being such a part of Buddhism. And if that's true.
Right, that's a good question too, yeah.
is a Zen or is a master, as you described it, is that, how would one become that? Is there a pathway? Who chooses to do that?
Yeah.
Is that something parents are proud their child decides to become that? The mechanics, I suppose, of
Yeah.
becoming a black belt.
So the Buddha himself, the historical figure, was raised to be a prince. And at his birth, a fortune teller came and said, your son will either be a prince or he'll renounce the world and become a spiritual leader. So this horrified his parents, who determined to protect him and shelter him, so that he would become the heir to the throne. But it didn't go that way. And after his awakening, Dad sent everyone he could to bring that boy back home. He sent the Buddha's son, who was named Impediment, wonderful name. His son to become one of the monks in his order of monks. And he sent, poor Buddha's wife, but probably also considered an impediment in those days. So where to go?
One question. When I read the history of Buddha, about the Buddha from Karen Armstrong, one of the things it said was that the Buddha had these tenets of which what it was required really to reach nirvana, part of that. And there were a few things I thought, well, white people can't renounce everything. White people not getting have sex.
Right.
And that was kind of key. So, but it looks like the Buddha must have allowed that people still could practice Buddhism somehow. So I can see, I don't know how that's going.
Yeah.
But the practicality.
So the Buddha taught to where the person was, that was, wealthy people came to him and he would have some teaching for them. And people, monks and nuns, came to him and would have teachings for them, always appropriate to their station in life. One of the big, like I said, there are a lot of lay Buddhists in Asia, and that is a venerated path. All right, so maybe to go back to, sorry, what was your first question? Do you remember?
Is Christianity
Oh, right.
maybe more prescriptive and versus contemplative
Yeah.
meditative? Um,
You know, when you actually engage with a Buddhist teacher, which is usually recommended, it all of a sudden becomes a lot more alive than reading about it in a book.
Right.
Like being invited to come in the room, do 3 prostrations before the Buddha figure, and to take up some kind of practice. And to have somebody maybe calling you on your stuff. Because Buddhism has enlightenment, but it also talks about defilement, the things that, the conditioned aspect of our being that keep us from perceiving our already awakened self. So it's very practice oriented. And, you know, what some of the basic teachings the Buddha offered to people were a path to the end of suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. For Buddha, the primary issue that everyone was dealing with was what is generally translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness or dukkha, a kind of pervasive sense that things are a little bit off in life and life hurts. And so what he found was freedom from the pain of life, a freedom that took away the pain and the fear of death, disease, old age, etc. And to achieve this, he taught an eightfold path called the Noble Eightfold Path. And I'll just read the steps of the Eightfold Path. It begins with understanding the teachings, right understanding and right thought. Then there are 3 steps that are concerning themselves with moral and ethical behavior, right speech, right action, right livelihood. For lay people, this is where their practice focuses on ethical behavior, much like I think in lay Christianity. Ethical behavior. Can I be generous? Can I be forgiving? Can I be a good person? And in this way, work through some of my karma and hopefully have a better life next time. So ethical practice. And then for the more monastically inclined, there are 3 steps: right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, that have to do with achieving transcendent states where enlightenment is possible. So so people get to choose. And I think the great gift of this time is we can be married in the world with a big job and an ardent spiritual practitioner. Because what better place to get in touch with your stuff, with your tendency to grasp and push away and all the interpersonal dynamics that Buddhism is so good at helping us work with. What better place to become aware of that than in a corporate setting, where it's really difficult, or in a marriage, or in a relationship with kids, or friends, or politicians maybe, if we have any politicians. They all, in our world, or wars going on, they all help us, they all can help us see that, oh, something here isn't right, doesn't feel right. So there's a line in all the Buddhist schools of Buddhism, there are paths to becoming an enlightened person. There are kind of traditional paths that would involve taking up the Eightfold Path. And maybe traditionally you might do this as a child, probably living in a monastery and probably going through several years of formal training, of reading the sutras, studying, doing devotional practice, and then perhaps taking up meditation practice at some point. So that is a well-traveled path, say. And there are ways of, these days, especially in America, you may find people say, well, enlightenment is just whatever that means to you. It's whatever that means to you. Because we're very aware of the cultural context within which awakening happens and how it may be experienced differently by different people. In Asia, it's more like, if you think you're awake, we have this panel of 5 also awake people, and they're gonna kind of see if they're gonna poke you and prod you and ask you a few questions to test your realization. So that there is a significant barrier to owning the title of enlightened teacher. And usually it goes through lineages, that a teacher will have a bunch of students and a certain number of them wake up and are given the empowerment to themselves.
Like teacher, is that what we said, bodhisattva, someone who can lead others towards enlightenment?
So, yes and no, so they might be considered a Zen master or a full teacher. One or the other, I don't know, does that help with that question about awakening?
Yeah, it does. But I have, like, I said, I have a bunch of questions, if you don't mind.
Anybody else? Just please.
Well, I just want to say before I have to leave, this is amazing because you're describing something with no metaphors, just plain talk. And I've never thought of church that way. And it's so exciting. And to begin a day, hello, the fish of the ocean. It's all amazing.
It's really a cosmic religion. And at one of the temples of Haeunsa in South Korea, where it's very patriarchal society, and Buddhism is very patriarchal. So the supreme, if you're not upset enough about the patriarchy, they have a supreme patriarch, and who was said not to go to sleep for the last 20 years of his life. He would be in meditation during the night hours instead of sleeping, constantly awake. Anyway, I don't know, maybe this is a mythological accretion, right? But to see him, I was to see him, to have an audience with him when I was in South Korea, but he was ill, thank God. But to see him, you have to do 3,000 prostrations, which inevitably, I could do about 100 in 15 minutes, and it takes a little time and your knees get bloody. So there's a real patriarch. If you think you have attained enlightenment, come here, grasshopper, and show me your enlightenment work. As one, there was a great Zen teacher. It was a Zen teacher to Leonard Cohen, if you know Leonard Cohen practiced Zen for many years and was the attendant to the Zen teacher in California. Anyway, he also taught some of the Trappist monks. And one of the questions he would give them was, show me your resurrection. So you're a Christian, you believe in Jesus. Show me the resurrection. Embody it for me. Here, go ahead, feel free. Show me your resurrection. Right? It be to embody that Christ energy beyond life and death, the resurrection. So you mentioned the bodhisattva idea. There's so many metaphors we could get into. But one of the really interesting archetypes of Buddhism is bodhisattva. Let me hear what you're wanting to.
Yeah, I have a question. You were talking about like 5 people lined up and elevating one or elevating somebody. In Christianity, there's a big spread between a fundamentalist Christian and a more liberal mainline product. Do you have the same thing in Buddhism? Would those 5 people have differences of opinion about who should be elevated and why?
They might, it might be politically motivated to some degree, but there is one main school of, speaking of South Korea right now, And, but it'd be pretty much true. There are two main schools in Japan. So it varies a little bit by country. But in South Korea, really, if you want to be a Zen monk, there's only one school to go to, Jogye Order of Zen Buddhism. And so they're gonna, whatever, they will work out, and I mean, it's probably not 5 people, it's probably the Supreme Patriarch or your teacher that would offer, that would confirm your awakening.
When you use the word patriarch, are there any women?
There are women as well. Right now, there's a very well-known chef, nun chef, who's been profiled on a Netflix series. And there's a whole order of Zen nuns as well as other types of nuns. Some of them are Zen masters, women Zen masters, but it's been a very male-dominated society, and that's changing now. And so probably the men are overrepresented.
I had one time I lived in Rogers Park, I went to see a Zen master, just to learn meditation and have just talk to him, learn some more. And he said, you know, you really can't be Christian and be Buddhist because you have all these belief systems and doctrines, and we're not about the abstract. We're about what we are about is the practice. And that's, you couldn't be attached to that.
Yeah.
And I that kind of put me off, right? Because I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. But I do think it's a difference between the two, isn't it? That we do tend to get into some abstract, systematic theology, and Buddha seemed to be a lot more based on practice.
I think that Buddha was very pragmatic. It's unfortunate that the Zen master, that his ideas got in the way of accepting, you know, you as or helping you as a student, and it's certainly not the norm, right? I think. But yeah, the Buddha was very pragmatic in the way he worked with people. He didn't like to answer questions like, is there a God? Is there life after death? Consider these philosophical questions that didn't help you achieve freedom from suffering. They were entertaining, they were captivating, but they weren't pragmatically important. And there was one teaching where he spoke of saying, it's as if a man's been shot with a poison arrow and has just minutes before the poison gets into his bloodstream and kills him. But there he is, slowly dying, asking, who shot this arrow? What was his motivation? Where is he from? What kind of arrow is this anyway? And what kind of poison? Who'll take care of my, and the Buddha said in all that time, he's slowly dying. And his aim was to pull the arrow of suffering out and then get on with life and let all that ephemera have its place. Unfortunately, you know, thousands of Buddhist scholars since then have delighted in fleshing all that out. So you can find musing on those metaphysical questions tended to be very pragmatic. And there are a lot of Christian Buddhists, a tremendous number. There are at least 5 Jesuit priests who are lineage holders in Japanese Zen Buddhism. That means installed as Zen teachers.
Well, it seems to me that one of the things that's happened in Christianity is that a lot of progressive Christianity has moved more towards practice of the faith. You know, keeping Sabbath, there'll be a lot of practices, you know, even learning to say no or say yes. There's so many practices and books on that, you know, and that is a move away from the abstract, except for some of that theology is pretty important. How you think about God, is God up there far away, or is it God with us? It's very important.
Yeah.
Practice.
And that would be in the Eightfold Path of right understanding, having a helpful view of the nature of reality. Right, when somebody comes to me for spiritual direction, comes to you for counseling, pastoral counseling, and they believe that God is out to get them and hates them, then you know they don't have, that's not a right understanding. Their view of the nature of God is out of alignment with reality. So we help them. Formation is about pointing people in the right general direction. But then they have to find that out through experience for themselves.
Right.
Is there an acting priest, Buddhist church or cathedral, or, I mean, you know, is it ever mixed and offered it to the public in a building?
There used to be a meditative group in Evanston that.
Yeah, there is.
It's still. And we all met, we went to study with Thich Nhat
I
Hanh
see.
for about a month at one point, and
But a known priest who also believes in Buddhist and
Right.
active priest. Is
Well,
that,
you'd have to think
Christian,
yeah,
a Christian priest.
yes, a Christian priest.
I'm not aware of one in the Chicago area. There was Father Patrick Hawk in Amarillo, would do Sunday prayer retreats and Zen retreats. He was in both lineages. Father Thomas Hand, who now passed away, a Jesuit in California, he would do Christian Buddhist retreats and then go celebrate the Mass.
Interesting.
You have to, you have to walk carefully if you're Catholic. So, yeah.
Either way.
So I just want to say something about the Bodhisattva idea or archetype. How many people are familiar at all with what you're about?
Bodhisattva archetype.
Right, Bodhisattva wouldn't take me by the hand. This is
Steely Dan?
Steely Dan, where it's called. Maybe title Bodhisattva, it's got a word in it. The Beastie Boys, I'm guessing this is a big Beastie Boy audience. Like white rappers have a song called Bodhisattva Vow, in which they dedicate their lives to the awakening of others. The lead singer of the Beastie Boys, now deceased, was a friend of the Dalai Lamas. So as Buddhism has evolved, this idea of the Bodhisattva came about really when it moved into China and Japan. And the Bodhisattva, so the aim of Buddhism is to achieve freedom from your conditioning so that you transcend life and death, birth and death, and are no longer subject to the conditioning that runs most of us. Early on, the ideal was to attain enlightenment and never be born again. Oh, thank God, I'm done with that place. We have to edit that out. That evolved to, I will taste awakening so that I can see and act clearly, not controlled by my conditioning. And having attained that freedom, I will choose after death to come back and to serve. Or I will choose in this lifetime to share the wisdom part that I do have, even if it's limited, however limited it is. There's no such thing as a perfect Buddha, except in mythology, to serve other beings. So this is a really powerful archetype of the Bodhisattva. Whether people really do that or not, I don't know. But this idea of tasting awakening and then coming back to serve. For me, it's very much the idea of the Christ who ascended the Mount of Transfiguration, had this glorious vision, and then said, no, we're not going to build an altar up here. We're going to go down the mountain to serve the people. And certainly in Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is considered to reincarnate over and over again. This is what the 15th Dalai Lama or something, over and over again. And the vow is, until all others have attained enlightenment, I shall remain, I shall return, I shall come in and willingly suffer among the people to help them. And there are sutras and stories of bodhisattvas hanging out in bars and bordellos and all kinds of unsavory places to help those people come forward, to help them awaken. So I think that's a great metaphor for these days, very similar to the idea of, Christ or Jesus, though though in the form of God, he willingly came into life and served the poorest of the poor, subjecting himself to the sufferings of being a human being, although he was also God.
And so it sounds like Buddhism is very much focused on the human condition. And that, you know, from the teachings and the readings and the practices that you put in place to effectively address the condition that you're in and over and transcend it. What, if that's a correct way to paraphrase what you've been saying, is what role, if any, does salvation play in Buddhism? Because there's obviously a key role in Christianity.
I think there's not a parallel. I mean, so Buddhism, certainly there's this idea that society in general is lost. We are lost in our confusion and our grasping after things and pushing away. Sometimes these are called greed, hatred, and delusion. And between those three things, we have the daily news. That's the news of the day. When the Buddha awoke, his first thought was, this teaching that I've discovered is so sublime, so impossible to describe, impossible to teach to anyone. I cannot teach it. All I can do, people are so confused, they'll misunderstand it. So think about the church today and how many people are making Jesus into all kinds of things that, well, we can only guess that you never intended. It certainly don't seem to reflect the gospel to me. So he said, I can't teach it. And then, moved by it, said that a God came down from a Hindu heaven and said, well, look at the suffering of the world. You have to do something. And his heart was touched by compassion and said, for the sake of the suffering beings, I will do what I can. And he began teaching. So it's kind of like that, that it's hard to, I've forgotten the original question I was answering, but hard to put into so many words, but you know, you can't help, if your intention is to help, you can't help it.
Seems like the Gospel of John talks about enlightenment and getting over illusions more than any of the Gospels. I find that's where I find some connection just with that.
I think the Gospel of John, that I and the Father are one.
Blindness, yeah.
And in Luke, the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth. Some people say it's here or there, but the kingdom is spread upon the earth, but people just can't see it. In the Gnostic, in the Gospel of Thomas, which is not canonical, there are lots of wisdom sayings that Buddhists will say, oh, I like Christianity when I see those parts. So.
Could I jump in and ask a question? Well, more comments than anything else. I too have walked through many faiths, practices, and philosophies during my life. One of the things I took away from Buddhism is this idea of suffering. And part of suffering for me comes from the feeling that I am utterly overwhelmed and there is nothing that I can do to change it. And that tends to increase one's suffering. And so if there is even a small thing in your life that you can say, I have the ability to manage or control this aspect, then your suffering decreases. Even if it's really small, like being able to thank somebody. Because in the act of thanking, you're connecting yourself to others and to the world and to the infinite. And that helps reduce your suffering, and it creates meaning in your life. The other comment I have is Thich Nhat Hanh, somewhere along the line, mentioned that he thought the next coming of the Buddha might not be in a single person, but as a community. And I was really intrigued by that notion and applying it to Christianity, that the next coming of the Messiah might not be a singular person, but a community of people who are dedicated and fully embodying doing the work of Jesus Christ on earth.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. Those are really right on, I think. And Thich Nhat Hanh did say, like to say, he thought the next Buddha would be the community of practitioners. We're certainly moving toward a more collective time. Young people are all into the collective, not such because of the dismantling of the power structures like the patriarchy. They're less likely to look to a singular leader, but than to look to the community. And we see how community gives us so much richer perspective on reality than what any one person can have. Yeah, thank you. And when I teach mindfulness, which I teach at DePaul, we have to deal with the overwhelming amount of information that's available to us. Then all the horrors of the daily news, and it can be overwhelming and cause depression. And then things like, of course, we hear about young people doom scrolling on their devices. I'm sure none of us do ever spend more time on our phones than we intended. But there is something to be said for like knowing our limits and restricting our intake, especially when there's very little we can personally do to help. We can do something for Ukraine. We can do something for the Mideast conflict war right now, but we have to, as you said, take good care of ourselves and not put ourselves in a position to be overwhelmed. So I know some people have left. You may need to leave. Please feel free. I think we have maybe till 1:45 or so.
Yeah, 9:45. So let's keep the questions going.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, what has come up tangentially reminded me that some people my generation and younger, Christians, American Christians, who are really interested and want to learn, and as much as they do, is really attractive to their peacefulness and to this new demographic we call them nuns, people who might be really spiritual Americans, but don't want to join any religious institution.
Yeah.
They're drawn to a lot of Buddhism, but some about the told, maybe it's just, I'm hoping you can tell us how something might have been lost in translation, but why is the first principle, all life is suffering?
Yeah.
And I've heard it just throwing a lot of people off.
Yeah.
Why should I be that depressed? What I mean, is there another way?
That's a great question. I mean, the Buddha he's not, that teaching, the Four Noble Truths are one, the reality of suffering. And number two, the cause of suffering. And number three is the end of suffering. And four is the path to the end of suffering. So that teaching is not meant to bum us out. It's meant to name what we're already experiencing. And for me, it's like going to a certain evangelical church where they're shouting at everyone that we're sinners. And I mean, to me, a sinner is someone who is somewhat alienated from their true self, from God. In that case, I'm definitely a sinner, but it can be used as a kind of cudgel or promotion for Christianity. If you're all sinners and we have what you need, so come here and be sure to leave 10% of your check at the door. It's a great marketing plan. And I think so, it may be that Christians hear this idea of suffering and think it's gonna be a downer. It might be a downer if you're like artificially elevated, using substances or something, to come in touch with the fact that there's some dissatisfaction, but it's not meant to keep more dissatisfaction on. Just to point out what you're already experiencing.
That, yeah, I guess just needs to be just made clearer.
Yeah.
This, young people in this affluent society,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like I'm suffering all the time. Should I feel guilty
Well,
about that?
see, that is, yeah, people can be detached from reality.
Yeah.
They can be dissociated, they can be living in a bubble. And just, with their music and their favorite influencers and just not really grounded in it. And then they see someone get sick and die or something. Yeah.
Well, if you think about what was the beginnings of both Buddhism and Christianity, it was a very deprived group. I mean, Buddhism, India at that time, and the early Christians were basically, again, a very deprived group. So their talk of suffering probably was pretty real.
I think that's a good point too, and it might have been more physical, where today a lot of our suffering is psychological. And there are books like Boris Becker's book, The Denial of Death, in which he suggests that most of society is geared toward helping us ignore the fact that we're going to die, but because that scares us. And so there are these aspects of reality. I mean, I'm 62 now, it's getting closer, it's getting clearer to me. And so I see some of you in your 50s at least, so we. But Buddhism offers an unflinching look at the real, at reality. And that is the path to freedom from these unconscious patterns we use to try to distract ourselves and keep ourselves artificially happy.
Can you address anxiety versus suffering? Because it strikes me this is somewhat circular, and it depends on where you enter the circle of mitigating your anxiety. Is that really suffering, or is that anxiety? It strikes me the two are related, but in a circular fashion.
Yeah, I would say there's physical suffering, emotional suffering, mental suffering. Mental suffering is like, what am I gonna do? I don't have a job, I don't know how to pay the rent. That's mental suffering. And there's existential suffering. What's my purpose here on earth? So they all come under the guise of suffering. What's my purpose? I feel lost. What's my purpose in this world? Is this all that there is, God? Is this all there is? To work this mindless job and support my family and then get old and die. So there is unavoidable suffering, like the pain of an injury, and then there's the suffering we add on to it, like worrying about it, or you're spinning off into anxiety about it. But there's a lot of anxiety. That's one of the great American forms of suffering right now. Anxiety, worry, projecting forward into the future, worrying about things in the future. Jesus said, something about let each day be all the problem. live for each day, the lilies of the field, they either, I'm not remembering, this part can be edited down, right? Anyway, there are suggestions, mindful approach. The students at DePaul, I mean, they're anxious, they're dissociating, they may have childhood trauma, they are worried about the future, they don't see particular reason to be optimistic about the future. Many of them, they no longer trust in the goodness of banks, governments, of institutions in general. They're very, not everyone, but it's a difficult time, and this is, you can imagine being a young person. We need to have that like basic trust and something to live for, something beautiful to live for.
How would, through the Buddhist lens, how would you compare enlightenment with, because Carl Jung's self-actualization?
Carl Maslow, self-actualization.
Yeah.
I think they could be basically the same. Because Maslow added self-actualization after he went to the Esalen Institute in California, which was all about transcendent consciousness transcending the sense of the individual ego self. And that is another way to think about enlightenment, awakening to, I'm not just Bill Epperly, this body, this persona, but I am actually one with everything. That's true for each one of you. We're one with everything. And we are, as Walt Whitman said, I am vast, I contain multitudes. We are our individual vehicle, but we're also one with everything. So Maslow talked about self-actualization as the highest level of this pyramid. In the Christian tradition, we talk about divine union, becoming one with God, or transforming union, in which God begins to work through us to bring that oneness to further oneness, maybe capable of infinite development oneness.
Thank you. It's a philosophy that all Americans should keep in perspective. Did our first transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, know much or read much of?
That's a good question. I don't know.
It sounds pretty similar.
Sounds like it might be, yeah.
And you mentioned Whitman.
Also Hegel.
Oh,
Hegel was a great transcendentalist.
What seems to be missing, and maybe having spent a month with Thich Nhat Hanh, I come away from with feelings of joy. This is a man, no taller than I am. Breakfast was silent, so you came from wherever you were sleeping, silent room. And at some point, it was time for the meetings to start. And he would get up, and in his pocket, he had a little knit cap that he put his little knit cap on. Anybody who wanted to could come and hold the seance. We're talking about 150 people. And in this spirit of the joy of fellowship, without a word being spoken, everyone felt it. Everyone felt it. And the breakfast place was on a hillside. The meeting area was down below. And so here's Thich Nhat Hanh holding the hands of whoever once held the seance, and often children, down the hill into the meeting place in the greatest reverence and joy that I've ever experienced. And I think that piece of the suffering and understanding of Buddhism often gets forgotten, but that's what he experienced. And that was my takeaway from that, was just the joy, There was on the stage, when you got to the big meeting center, a series of bells. One of the bells was probably 9 feet tall and maybe 9 feet wide. And he invited anybody who wanted to, particularly the children, to come up to meet, see the bells. And one of the young children got up there under this big bell and she looked underneath. And he came from the other side and he looked underneath too. And so here the two of them were sort of exploring the wonder of what was this bell like under here. So that's the sense of joy and therefore the peace that comes with that is something that I think somehow is hard to convey about Buddhism through something you read or something like that, but it's very definitely there, and it's how he lived.
And then that's, I think, another point that we'll maybe next time talk more about possible gifts for our culture. But the ability, the facing this sense of suffering and unease within us opens us up when we're able to embrace that and be with it, rather than looking for a better place to be. Then the small moments can become a moment of great fulfillment. But one of the high points of my life, in terms of my experience in the moment, was because I had one of those moments, where I was one with everything, was cleaning the floor of a kitchen on my hands and knees while studying for a doctorate in biochemistry. The doctorate in biochemistry gave me not nearly the satisfaction of that moment of aliveness.
What's that movie, Karate Kid?
Karate Kid.
The sort of, I forget what the phrase
Wax
about,
on.
I with your hands.
So I think that's part of the promise of it, is to be able to find God in every moment, or find simple joy in every moment.
Well, it's as good a place to leave it as ever. It's been an hour, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bill.
Thank you. Sir, your final quizzes? No,
Yes.
I thought we might do a little meditation. Maybe we'll do that next time.
Okay.
I might use some of these verses for that, but these are some verses that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, the 9 prayers, and then one of the more well-known sutras or teachings of the Buddha, the teaching on loving kindness.